What if the version of Jesus you have been following is not the real one? Not because you rejected him, not because you stopped believing, but because somewhere between the pew and the page, the uncomfortable parts got quietly removed. The edges got filed down, and what was left felt like faith, looked like faith, and cost you almost nothing. That is not a small problem. That is the problem. Because Jesus never promised a life that fits comfortably around your existing plans. He promised a cross. And most of us have spent years rearranging our lives around a version of him that never said that. What he actually said is what we need to talk about right now. There was a man, a genuine believer, a deacon in his church for 11 years. He served on the worship team. He tithed faithfully. By every visible measure, he was a committed Christian. Then one morning, reading through Matthew chapter 7, he hit a sentence he had somehow never truly absorbed before. He sat with it for a long time. And then quietly, honestly, he said to himself, I have been doing this for Jesus, but I have never actually surrendered to him. I have been performing faith. I have not been living it. That moment cracked something open in him. And the question he sat with that morning is the same one worth asking right now. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus says, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Deny himself, not his bad habits, not his past, himself. The self that makes decisions, the self that sets the agenda, the self that negotiates with God about what it is willing to give. Jesus is not describing a spiritual discipline here. He is describing a death. You do not carry a cross to a retreat. You carry a cross to an execution. And here is where most modern Christianity quietly substitutes something smaller. Giving up comfort becomes the cross. Choosing a difficult ministry becomes the cross. Waking up early for devotionals becomes the cross. But these are not what he meant. He meant the death of the right to run your own life. Every plan you protect, every version of the future you are holding on to, every identity you have built that you would defend if he threatened it. That is what he is asking you to lay down, completely. Now think about what that actually means on a Tuesday afternoon. Not in a worship service, not during a sermon. On an ordinary Tuesday, when your career is pulling in one direction, your family is pulling in another, and God seems to be asking for something that makes no financial sense and no social sense, and will cost you relationships you have spent years building. That is the cross, not the dramatic version, the quiet, daily, grinding version, the one that requires you to choose him over your own wisdom, repeatedly, with no applause, no affirmation, and no guarantee of what comes next.
Most people never get there. Most people manage a version of Christianity that requires just enough sacrifice to feel genuine, but not enough to actually hurt. And Jesus does not call that discipleship. He calls it the wide road. In Matthew chapter 7, he says, The gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. The gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Few. That word should land differently than it usually does, because the wide road in this passage is not populated by atheists and criminals. It is populated by people who called themselves followers, people who were close enough to hear his teaching, who responded with something, but who never went through the narrow gate, never made the costly decision, never allowed their faith to disrupt their actual life. And then, immediately after saying this, Jesus says something that is among the most frightening words in all of Scripture. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. These are not cold, indifferent people. These are people who were active, devoted, visible. They prophesied, they cast out demons, they did mighty works, and he looks at everything they built in his name and says, "I never knew you."
Not that he once knew them and they wandered, never. Which means the entire structure of their religious life was disconnected from a real, living relationship with him. They were doing things for him that he never asked for, in a relationship they had largely constructed themselves. That is not a distant historical warning. That is a mirror. And now we arrive at the verse most people genuinely believe they understand and genuinely do not practice. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Not tolerate them, not forgive them from a safe distance. Love them. Pray for them. The word he uses is agape, the same word used for God's love toward a broken and rebellious humanity. He is commanding that same quality of love toward the person who has cost you the most. Here is what that looks like in a real life. A woman in her 50s, divorced after a painful betrayal, sitting in a small group where they were studying this passage. The leader asked, "Is there anyone you have not forgiven?" She did not speak, but her jaw tightened and her eyes went somewhere else for a moment. She knew the name. She had been sitting in church every Sunday for 4 years, singing about grace, and she had never once genuinely prayed for the person who dismantled her marriage. Not once. Not a real prayer. Not a prayer that wished them well.
She was not a hypocrite. She was a wounded person, doing what wounded people do. But she had also been allowing herself to believe that managing her bitterness quietly was the same as walking in love. It was not. And Matthew chapter 5 does not offer a different instruction for people who were genuinely wronged. It just says, love them. And then there is the teaching that cuts deeper than almost any other, because it goes directly to what most of us are actually depending on. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, "No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." He does not say it is difficult. He does not say it requires wisdom and balance. He says you cannot. It is an impossibility stated as a fact. And he is speaking to people who loved God, people already in the room, already following him. Because money in this passage is not just about wealth. It represents every system that promises you security, identity, significance, and control outside of God. Your savings account is not the enemy. Your need to feel financially secure before you can fully trust him might be. Your career is not the enemy. Your unwillingness to risk it for obedience might be. The question he is raising is not what you have, it is what you cannot release. Because whatever you cannot release is what you are actually serving.
And he says you cannot hold that and hold him simultaneously. Not both, not together. One master. That is not a metaphor. That is a structural reality about where your trust actually lives. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus adds something that almost no one preaches directly. He says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." This is not commanding hatred. Jesus is using the sharpest possible language of priority and contrast. He is saying that your devotion to him must be so total, so consuming, so absolute that every other love in your life looks pale by comparison, including the people you would die for, including your own survival instincts. There is a story of a young man from a devout Hindu family in South Asia who came to faith in Christ in his early 20s. When he told his family he did not lose their approval, he lost everything: his place in the home, his inheritance, his marriage arrangement, his community, his identity as his father knew it. He was not asked to make a difficult choice. He was asked to choose between Jesus and everything else at the same time. He chose Jesus, and he would tell you it was the hardest thing he ever did, and the only thing that made him fully alive. Because he went through the narrow gate. He did not find a way to keep one foot on either side. He walked through, and Luke chapter 14 was not a distant theological concept to him. It was a Tuesday. That is what Jesus meant.
And now, the verse that removes every last ground of self-reliance from beneath you. In John chapter 15, Jesus says, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing." Nothing. Not less effectively, not with diminished returns. Nothing. A branch that is cut from the vine does not produce inferior fruit. It produces nothing. It withers. It is removed. And here is the unbearable precision of this. You can be busy and disconnected. You can be visibly productive and spiritually dry. You can serve, lead, teach, counsel, give, and maintain every external marker of a faithful believer, all while being a branch that has quietly, slowly, without anyone noticing, including yourself, drifted from genuine dependence on him. The busyness does not prove connection. The activity does not prove abiding. Only fruit born from real, sustained, daily reliance on him is the real thing. And only you and he know whether that is actually happening right now. So here is where all of it lands. These words are not suggestions wrapped in ancient poetry. They are the actual shape of what Jesus said discipleship looks like. Deny yourself, carry the cross, love the enemy, walk the narrow road, refuse to let money be your master, love him above everyone, including yourself, and abide in him not as a theology, but as a living, daily, moment-by-moment dependence.
This is what he said, not the softened version, not the version that fits on a coffee mug or closes a service on a hopeful note, the version that made people in the crowd stop walking with him because the words were too hard. The version that has the power to split your life in two, the life you have been living and the life he is describing. And here is the thing that makes all of this not just sobering, but urgent. You are not promised tomorrow to get this right. The deacon who realized he had been performing faith, he had that morning. The woman holding bitterness for 4 years in a small group room, she had that night. The young man choosing between his family and his God, he had that moment. Each of them was given a door, a narrow one, and they had to decide whether to go through it. You have this moment, not to perform more, not to try harder, not to add spiritual disciplines to a life that is still fundamentally ordered around yourself. To stop, to go back to Matthew chapter 16 and actually read it. To ask honestly whether the life you are living right now, not in theory, not in your intentions, the actual daily shape of your life, whether it looks anything like what Jesus described.
Because he also said in John chapter 10 that he came so that you may have life and have it abundantly. That is real. That is not canceled by everything else he said. But that life runs through the narrow gate. It is reached by the cross. It is sustained by abiding in him. It is lived in full surrender. It is not comfortable, but it is the only thing he actually promised. The question he is placing in front of you right now is not whether you believe these words are true. You probably do. The question is whether the life you walked into today, the decisions waiting for you this week, the loyalties you are protecting, the wounds you are holding, the security you are unwilling to release, whether any of that is being shaped by what he actually said, or whether you have been following a version of Jesus that never asked you for anything that cost you. That is the question, and it does not go away when this ends.